Hello and welcome to this lecture on the Geopolitics Reader, the second edition of which was published in 2006. This lecture is really only going to provide discussion of critical geopolitics, and the conceptualization of the reader is certainly not a substitute for the actual process of working through the different sections of the reader. So I'm going to largely concentrate on the introduction and make some general arguments about critical geopolitics. Now, geopolitics is a particular term, and any attempt to construct a geopolitics reader has to confront the fact that it is polysemous. It has multiple meanings. In one sense, geopolitics is a necessary fiction, or it's a convenient fiction. It is a term which has a series of different meanings depending on the context of its use. One doesn't need to have any kind of abstract definition of it. One doesn't have to declare in general terms, geopolitics is this and that. What one needs to be aware of is simply the term geopolitics is deployed in a series of different ways. And let's talk about some of these ways. There is a perhaps more narrow understanding of the concept of geopolitics, which is associated with the word geopolitics. And the word was coined originally by a Swedish political scientist, conservative politician by the name of Rudolf Schelling in 1899. And he used it to describe approaches to politics which were grounded in the earth. It was a part of his kind of schema for understanding international relations and politics. And the term geopolitics, therefore, in one meaning, is just associated with those who use the term geopolitics. Expanding that a little bit, you can argue that there's a geopolitical tradition, and that geopolitical tradition really begins in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century with figures like Schelling and also contemporaries of his like Alfred Mackinder. Now, Mackinder is interesting because Mackinder actually never used the word geopolitics. He didn't particularly like the term, but nowadays most people will associate the word geopolitics with Alfred Mackinder. The term was certainly used by the Nazis, by Karl Haushofer, who did join the Nazi Party, although his wife was half Jewish, and it was used by Hitler and others, and it was a consequence of its notoriety in the Third Reich that it became known across the world. And then one refugee from the Third Reich, Henry Kissinger, single-handedly revived the term in the 1970s in the United States to describe his particular approach towards international affairs, his particular kind of balance of power, realist approach to international, the foreign policy of the United States. So we have a number of different definitions, and they get slippery very quickly. But to simplify somewhat, you can say there's a geopolitical tradition which has to do with various key thinkers, wise men, if you will, and it begins with perhaps Friedrich Ratzel, a German political geographer in the late 19th century, then moves on to Alfred Mackinder, Schelling, then we would perhaps include Alfred Mahan as part of this, and then we might include such figures as Nicholas Spickman in the 1940s in the United States, and then we would bring it up to the contemporary period by talking about Kissinger, Alexander Haig, and Zbigniew Brzezinski and others who have a certain fond likeness for the term. Colin Gray is a contemporary figure who also uses the term. That is one definition. It's a sort of wise man geopolitical tradition definition. And then it is worth distinguishing that from Kissinger's understanding, because Kissinger actually uses the term as a synonym for world politics, or how he conceived of world politics, which is really interstate competition and as the struggle for primacy amongst the superpowers. Now, that particular understanding of geopolitics is one which uses the term geopolitics to describe what Agnew wants to term the modern geopolitical imagination. And Kissinger's term became very popular. It was used in the media quite a bit, and so very quickly international relations and the study of international relations was conceptualized as geopolitics. There is a slippage in that, on the one hand, Kissinger really is using the term geopolitics to describe a particular approach to international relations. But on the other hand, in popular usage, geopolitics becomes merely a synonym for international relations writ large. And it's that kind of confusion of a particular approach to with international relations writ large, which shows you the degree to which what Agnew calls the modern geopolitical imagination was very, very successful in dominating and mastering international relations and thinking about international relations. Because there are many other approaches, many other understandings of international relations other than the particular realist-derived conception that Kissinger used. And there's lots of problems with Kissinger's particular approach, and including it whether it was quote-unquote realist or not. That's another matter which we don't need to take up here. Third understanding of geopolitics is one where you take it at its broadest meaning, and that is that it's the clash of geography and politics. And there, putting the hyphen in between kind of reminds you of the geographical, and how the geographical and how we understand the geographical is inevitably a political exercise. Maps are necessarily political. They reflect particular cultures. The very act of mapping has a whole history of imperialism and acts of conquest. It's often has to do with control. And politics itself is in part about organizing space. It's a part about naming particular places, naming the here and the there, the us and the them, the drawing of boundaries between objects. So this is a much more kind of philosophical understanding of geopolitics. And it's that sense which critical geopolitics as a particular approach returns to. It wants to explode rather narrow understandings of geopolitics and argue that if you push these understandings, in actuality, a lot of set of issues open up which are very much to do with this clashing politics and geography and how both of these things come together. Ultimately, geopolitics it's problematic. It's a field of problems, a field of questions. It is a field of practices, and rather than defining it in any abstract way, rather one intervenes, whether one writes on these particular issues. Okay, so let's talk about the term critical geopolitics. Well, the term critical geopolitics really dates from the 1980s. And it is a term that I and a number of others have done much to popularize. It comes out of a context, which is the Second Cold War, and an attempt to try to critique the foreign policy practice of the Reagan administration, particularly in Central America. Now, you will recall at that time, the Reagan administration saw rebellion in El Salvador and the revolt and revolution in Nicaragua as being instigated by the Soviets, and they interpreted what was going on there as a case of the Soviets intervening in the American sphere of influence, and there therefore being a domino effect in Central America, which would eventually lead to Mexico going communist, and then the communists would be at the southern border. Now, this particular form of discourse seems hyper-real and crazy in the contemporary period. But nevertheless, it was used by people like Alexander Haig and by Ronald Reagan himself when he first came to power in 1980. And it is a particular discourse which, in classic modern geopolitical imagination terms, completely neglects the specificity, the geographical particularity of Nicaragua, what was happening there, its political economy, and El Salvador. And so therefore critical geopolitics was an attempt to recover the geographical and to write back against this very crude geopolitical optic which was used to intervene in these particular countries. It then subsequently became more broadly the name for an approach which tackled the linguistic form, the discursive form of geopolitics. Now, critical geopolitics begins by the assumption that geopolitics is a discourse. That is a critical move first and foremost, because it is refusing to concede that geopolitics is as the world really is. And what it does is it begins to analyze how it is that certain geopolitical thinkers construct the world. And they do so through a declarative act. They basically adopt a position which critical geopoliticians call the God trick, the view from nowhere, where they make grand pronouncements on the state of the world and on what is going on in certain countries and the meaning of that. And these particular declarations are supposed to be objective. They're supposed to be how things really are. But then, quite closely following that particular declarative mood, there is another move, which is an imperative move, which argues this is what we need to do about the state of the world, about the particular state of things that has just been described. And so there's a commitment to a particular identity and commitment to a particular action. So in actuality, geopolitics, even though it presents itself as objective, very, very quickly moves into an imperative political mode. So it is a geo/politics. It's a form of geographical politics. It's an incitement to and a practice of politics, rather than being any kind of a neutral description of the world. So the first move of critical geopolitics is to point this out and to challenge this kind of God trick, by asking the question, how is it possible to think that? How is it possible to think, for example, that the Sandinistas are really a Soviet beachhead in Central America? And therefore, you begin to question the acts of the strategist and the particular culture and political commitments of the strategist, the person who is making these particular pronouncements. The challenging seeing and challenging the perspectivalism of geopolitics is a very important part of critical geopolitics. And it rests upon a social theoretical argument. And that argument is that in the Western tradition, the faculty of sight, the faculty of seeing, is one which is given great privilege, and it is one which has the least amount of critical consciousness associated with it. When we look out on the world, we supposedly see how things really are. And seeing, therefore, is supposedly believing, it's supposedly what is the truth. But one has to ask questions about that which makes seeing possible. And that which is not seen in the seeing are, of course, the cultural background, the very cultures that allow us to recognize in the world certain types of objects, certain types of situations, use certain types of metaphors to describe. Language itself is a culture. As you know, different cultures have different understandings of color. Color is not something which is objective, it is something which is cultural. So it very quickly leads us to a critical discourse analysis where you are bringing back into the act of seeing that which makes seeing possible, which is, of course, cultural assumptions. And that is part of the exercise of critical geopolitics. It is asking, how is it possible to see that? Now, challenging seeing ultimately is about challenging expertise. It is about challenging who gets to speak and what their particular background is, what their cultural commitments are, and what is taken seriously as knowledge and that which is not taken seriously, that which is marginalized. So you very quickly begin to analyze a whole political economy of knowledge and knowledge power structure. And it's a Foucaultian concern with knowledge power that drives critical geopolitics. Okay, so the second move that characterizes critical geopolitics is to assert the cultural embeddedness of the larger geographical politics that comes together to make geopolitics. And there is a certain explosion of the notion of geopolitics as something which is narrow. Instead, in critical geopolitics, you have an investigation of how so much of foreign policy and so much of everyday life about and awareness and knowledge about international affairs is geopolitical. And so one of the moves that characterizes critical geopolitics is to expand that which is considered to be the geopolitical beyond the narrow realm of the productions of a set group of wise men, strategic thinkers, expanded in terms of analyzing the political class writ whole, those who are in power, those who are ambassadors, those who are politicians, those who are in Congress and elsewhere, and their particular discourse as a form of practical geopolitics, an everyday kind of implicit kind of tacit knowledge, the ease with which they use certain situation descriptions and certain storylines in order to understand international affairs. And then also linking that to popular culture and certain assumptions and certain forms of knowledge within popular culture about foreign places more generally. And so these forms of popular culture range from television programs to movies, to magazines, to cartoons, and there's a whole set of literature now on cartoons and how they're significant in forming certain images of foreign places and enabling certain forms of storylines about particular foreign policy issues and crises and particular places and threats. So what you have within critical geopolitics is expanding well beyond the more formalized forms of geopolitics, what looked like geopolitics in the past, like the book which says the geopolitics of X or the geopolitics of Y. And it looks at the larger cultural archive that makes possible understandings and knowledge about international affairs. Now, what you have with the geopolitics reader is the introduction of a set of terms to try to provide analytical purchase on geopolitics in this broader sense. And the terms that I want to focus in on here are, first of all, geopolitical culture. Now, geopolitical culture is the particular culture of states. It's a state notion. It is what a state and those who govern a state and live in a state, how they see their state and how that state has been shaped by its geographical and historical situation, so that the state has a certain sense of itself within the world. It's part of how it sees itself. Now, we know that certain states like the United States have multiplicity. They have more than one tradition for understanding foreign policy, whether it be a kind of a stay-at-home, isolationist tradition, or whether it be an internationalist tradition, same in Russia and elsewhere. And so within geopolitical cultures, you have a series of different foreign policy philosophies which congeal into geopolitical traditions. So we can identify 2, 3, 4 different geopolitical traditions. For example, Mead in his work argues that 4 different traditions in American foreign policy: the Jacksonian tradition, the Wilsonian tradition, the Hamiltonian, and the Jeffersonian tradition. And you have similar traditions that one can identify in Russia and in other countries as well. Now, separate from those which are more kind of formalized foreign policy schools of thought, you have geopolitical imaginations. And geopolitical imaginations are part of geopolitical cultures, but they are really more the popular geopolitics, what everyday people think about foreign policy and about foreign places more generally. And here you have to say that geopolitical imaginations of contemporary Americans, ordinary Americans, their notions of foreign places tend to not be very geographically detailed and very geographically specific. So the geopolitical imaginations of most Americans are determined by moral categories rather than by geographic knowledge. And that is one of the features of the American geopolitical culture. Now, within the geopolitical culture, then, of course, we can focus on particular discourses and their operation in the political system, in the State of the Union addresses, for example, of presidents, in popular culture, as well as the formal geopolitical productions of those that aspire to be strategic analysts, certain think tanks, strategic study centers. Those are kind of distinct genres where geopolitics comes together and is congealed in a particular form. Now, behind that is the state structures, the history, the geography, the identity, the state system as a whole. And here you can plug in John Agnew's concept of the modern geopolitical imagination as a part of the deep structure of modernity, and how that helps shape and configure the geopolitical imaginations and geopolitical traditions of certain countries. But we must also be aware that, as we know from Agnew's theory, that there are other processes, other material forces going on. You have globalization, you have technological change, which produce understandings of the world and material realities which confound state-centric concepts of geopolitics. So therefore we can have geopolitical cultures being shaped by geographies, material geographies of time-space compression, which challenge simple binaries and the ability of certain traditions to assert simple binaries in the world, clear distinctions between us and them. Third move characterizing critical geopolitics is to reassert power. Because one of the characteristics of orthodox geopolitics or conventional geopolitics is that there's no analysis of power within the state, or if there is one, it's very, very limited. There's no analysis of that which makes the very act of geopolitical strategizing possible. Instead, what you have is a commitment to a particular identity, to a particular political project. And so critical geopolitics has a much more scholarly attitude here. It refuses to be problem-solving philosophy for the state. And it refuses the my country right or wrong. It refuses an easy us versus them, or an easy we. And it does so because it wants to have a commitment towards a much more cosmopolitan vision. Not simply the separation of the academy from the state, but a commitment to the idea that no one state is inherently virtuous in the world, and that therefore the best form of political engagement and the best form of scholarly and intellectual engagement is to constantly be critical and to look at the power networks, the political economy that produces certain types of geopolitical discourses, and to look at the vested interests behind these geopolitical discourses. The particular geopolitical discourses that dominate in a state reflect the exercise of power. They reflect political power, ideological power, economic power, and military power. How is it possible to think that? Well, in part because certain structures of power have enabled particular figures, not necessarily the smartest people, not necessarily the most virtuous intellectually, to come to power, because they serve particular or not seen to be threats to a certain political order within the state, a certain class order, a certain material order, and therefore they are quote-unquote taken seriously. They have the right to speak. Now, what you're analyzing here are entwined structural networks of power, and these are important to understand the self-interested nature of a lot of geopolitical discourse, the particular interests that it's serving, so that therefore geopolitical discourse doesn't be seen simply in pure idealist terms. It is an argument made in a grand scholarly argument. No, it is politics itself. It is power itself being asserted. So critical geopolitics, its form of geopolitics, because it is a geopolitics, is to point this out, to reveal the power structures and to reveal the acts of power which enable certain forms of geopolitical reasoning to go forward, to dominate and to be hegemonic. And in challenging that, it seeks to broaden democratic debate about these particular questions. It seeks to speak truth to power and to argue for a more democratic form of geopolitical discourse, and one which is ultimately more accurate in its rendering of the world. So critical geopolitics as a project is about constant, ceaseless questioning of geopolitical discourses and how they operate. It seeks to challenge the ways in which these geopolitical discourses classify the world, how they organize space, and how they seek to represent certain situations as the way, supposedly, how they naturally are. It seeks to constantly recover the culture involved in geopolitical discourse and then the acts of power in it. So that's a kind of overview of the project of critical geopolitics, and that is a project which informs the geopolitics reader. So when going through the various sections of it, you'll get a sense of how critical geopolitics works as a deconstructive practice. Ultimately, this deconstructive practice is not meant to be destructive, but constructive, to open up space for greater political debate, to make possible better, richer, more robust, more empirically justifiable forms of geopolitical knowledge, and also to challenge the power of certain private vested interests and certain political economies in shaping the foreign policy of the whole, the foreign policy of the public. Ultimately, critical geopolitics believes in the public interest and believes in opening up debate rather than closing off debate on geopolitics.